Chapter 3. The Saperhoth Rationing. That's a whole lot of food, said Jint, scanning the surroundings inside the vessel. But I fear it's still not enough, replied a woman named Lana Fazan, the Rationing Corps chief officer. With the provisions brought aboard the amphibious ship Daxaith inspected and sorted, it was time to apportion them to the prisoner population. Jint requested to come along, seeing this as an opportunity to see the conditions on this land world up close and personal. The Rationing Corps was made up of 6 airships, 5 of which were cargo freighters filled to the brim with food provisions. The 6th was the commanding vessel, aboard which rode Jint and the chief officer. Also aboard ship were more than 30 of Lobnus's armed guards, as well as Samson and his makeshift bodyguard unit. Jint didn't know what kind of gun the prison guards were wielding, probably some type of stun gun, but he did know he didn't want to see any of them fired, especially not at him and his people. Including Jint, the Empire contingent numbered no more than 8. There was no way they could win a scuffle. Ugh, I'm such a worrier, thought Jint, shaking his head. Lobnus needed the Empire for the food, and its government employees were seeking asylum to boot. They had no latitude to be butting heads against the Empire. What's the matter? Asked Fazan with inquiring eyes. She had a machine translator on, perhaps so as to pay Jint's group some mind. Yet the presence of such a device was not always welcome. Neither Baranu nor the official language of the Rikparl were Jint's mother tongue. From what he'd been taught at the Quartermaster Academy, Rikparl was much easier to learn than Baranu, and its grammar was fairly similar to Martinese, too. For Jint, who still thought in the language of his homeworld, Rikparl was the tongue with which he had a greater facility. But now that the other party was using a translation device, he was forced to speak Baranu despite that fact. Oh no, it's nothing. I see. Well then, let's take the air. The airship hovered upward and slowly swiveled. Looking down below, he could see the zone with the administrative building was built like a fortress citadel. At the center lay a park, with the office building towering beside it. Tall walls encircled the perimeter of the residential dwellings that surrounded the tower. The walls were double-layered, with some kind of mechanism installed within. Their fear of the prisoners, that had them so outnumbered, rang loud and clear. With security that strict, what need is there to emigrate? Thought Jint. The vast stretch of ocean was visible, too, and though he hadn't noticed them when he was looking down from the amphibious ship, there were spire-like structures standing in a ring around the island. What are those? Asked Jint. They're observation posts. Not even a single scrap of wood floating on the water can escape our sight, answered Fazan. Seems to me like it'd be pretty tough to escape even if they do manage to make it across the ocean, laughed Samson. They could make it to other zones, said Fazan, eyes locked straight ahead, which would invalidate the whole point of them. It'd put those big OL walls to waste, that's for sure, said Samson, pointing at the ramparts that divided the correctional zones into 3 distinct areas. They looked just as formidable as the walls that closed off the administrative zone. If you ask me, you ought to have just divided them across different planets, Samson murmured. Fazan heard that. Inhabitable planets are a precious resource. Then do it like the Empire and make orbital prisons. And have them spend their whole lives off-planet, she said, looking Samson's way for the first time. That would be inhumane. Samson laughed again, telling Jint, guess a war was bound to happen. Look how differently they think from the off. But you don't want to live your whole life out in space, either, Mr. Samson, said Jint. Of course not. If anybody ever told me I'm not allowed back on a land world, I'd stoke a rebellion myself. Fazan looked surprised, but she didn't get into it, instead changing the subject. Look, that's the East Correctional Zone. They cast their eyes down toward where the Rationing Corps chief officer's finger pointed. The wall wound tortuously across the low verdant hills, which were smattered with bushes and shrubberies. The vista was so idyllic that the lack of cattle lying peacefully on the green was difficult to swallow. Going by His Excellency the Warden's words, a rebellion could ignite at any moment, said Jint. But it sure doesn't look like it. The rebellion is already underway, said Fazan. Huh. The distribution center was completely destroyed due to organized looting. Are there people in the distribution center? Asked Samson. No. Not since it was automized. You see, This isn't the first time rioting has broken out. And thankfully, because of that automation, no one was hurt. You said the looting was organized, said Jint. Was it that Anguizan guy leading them? I don't know, she answered bluntly. Wait, if there's no distribution center, then what are you going to do? We're going to airdrop. But then how are you going to make sure everyone gets their fare? It can't be helped, interrupted Fazan testily. This is what their actions have gotten them. We can't be responsible for how they behave. If I've touched a nerve, I apologize. It's just that I've always been the curious type. It will take more than that to offend me. From around halfway up the hills to the seashore, structures that looked like boxes from above were closely packed together. They could only be the prisoners' housing. Those domiciles were originally pure white. Now look at them, frowned Fazan. Taken together, they appeared to be black. But the closer the airship drew, the easier it was to tell that that black was in fact a mix of various different colors. There were still some white buildings visible here and there, but the majority of them were painted over. Drawing closer still, one could see how most of the dwellings were decorated with bright hues. Some even boasted palettes that one might think more fitting for a little girl's bedroom than a male prisoner's detention zone. However, thanks to how crowded in the boxes were, and how there was no overall pattern or order to the colors, they seemed blackish from afar. And while Fazan clearly disapproved, Jin thought the place was beautiful in its own way. He suddenly recalled that time his foster parents yelled at him for tossing his toys all over his room. Whoa there, why the long face? Asked Samson. It's nothing. As of late, thoughts of his days on his homeworld rarely ever bubbled to the fore, but when the memories did surface, he still felt that twinge of pain. Seems like they've got more than enough paint lying around. You said it. Wonder if we'll have to supply them with more paint if it runs out too. They made the paint themselves, said Fazan. They'll smash rocks or what have you and mix the stuff with glue. Wow, you've got to admire their effort, said Samson. I just hope it stops at things like paint. Do they make weapons too? They do. Though all they can make is the type that needs gunpowder. Then there must be murders happening every day, right? Not exactly. They have something akin to a self-governing body, and a level of public security is maintained as a result. That being said, there are deaths under mysterious circumstances every once in a while. We suspect they're victims of execution by the self-governing body, but there's no proof. So the prisoner representatives didn't just pop out of nowhere, said Jint. Right. Those representatives have been around for a while, and they each seized on this chance to declare themselves the premier of the star system. I see. Finally, some heartening news, thought Jint. After all, if the prisoners had such high self-governing capabilities, then a functioning star system government might come together more smoothly than he'd feared. He'd been worried what would happen once the jailers all fled the coop, but now he was thinking it just might be easier to govern with them gone anyway. Though he didn't much care to contemplate how a land world comprised solely of the criminal element would evolve over time. There's a bigger fish to fry than the weapons. The drug manufacturing, said Fazan, dashing the ray of hope Jint had worked so hard to find. And by drugs, I don't mean cold remedies. I figured, he said. I'm not stupid, lady. You mean narcotics. Narcotics manufacture is the biggest industry on this planet. Not that it contributes to the planet's economy at all. And you're not clamping down? Our policy is not to. Nothing would come of it. What do you mean? The UH doesn't believe in capital punishment. Getting sent to this place is the most severe punishment there is. So no matter how much more crime they commit, it's all a wash in the end. But aren't there in-prison punishments? Said Samson. Like solitary confinement? They have that on my homeworld. There's another reason we don't clamp down. We're short-staffed, she stated succinctly. The airship had descended so low that they could now make out the prisoners that were milling about with their naked eyes. Once the airdrops commenced, the inmates went on the move, with more pouring out of the dwellings. Jint's eyes tracked the falling boxes. He assumed some mechanism would activate on the way down to slow them down, but no, there was some air resistance, but still they plummeted as gravity dictated. And then they crashed, smashing a domicile or two in the process. Sure hope nobody was in there, thought Jint. That's some merciless rationing, decried Samson. What other choice do we have? Snapped Fazan. Nobody ever expected we'd have to airdrop their provisions. You could have at least hitched them to parachutes. There are no parachutes in the inventory list. On this planet, we've no access to even the most unsophisticated gear. But worry not. We've already calculated the impact on the food. 90% ought to still be good to eat. And the other 10% can be made edible with a little elbow grease. All they need to do is pick out the wedged shrapnel. Jint considered telling her that he hadn't granted the cargo aboard the Daxaith and that he was planning to have the bill reimbursed later, but he ultimately decided not to say anything. The jailers would all be leaving Lobnis soon, and the obligation to repay would be taken up by a land-world administration made up of the prisoner population. And now the headache's back. Paying for one's purchases was the most sacred custom among all of humanity, let alone the of. But would a planet full of criminals respect that? Miss Fazan, said the airship's pilot, turning around, we're under attack. What did you say? Looks like you've miscalculated, said Samson, arms folded. Fazan ignored him. Damage report? No damage as of yet. All they've done is peel off some of the paint job. Jint did hear pinging sounds strike the hull. He looked down at the surface and strained his eyes, but he couldn't tell who was firing. When Jint drew even closer to the window, something slammed against the pane separating him from the outside world. He ducked involuntarily. That he didn't yelp with fear was a feat to be proud of. When he looked behind him, Samson was there, smirking at him. Jint smiled sheepishly back, then resumed looking through the window. He touched the glass. There were no cracks. It looked as though being under attack wasn't a life-threatening predicament. Nevertheless, as long as he didn't know what kinds of weaponry the prisoners had in store for them, it was best to remain on the alert. Is the airdrop almost over? Asked Jint. It'll be over shortly. This airship doesn't have an airdropping apparatus, so we're employing the most primitive means, said Fazan. Why don't we stop for now and turn back, suggested Jint. Everything's okay. You saw how their weapons have no effect on the airship, didn't you, Your Excellency? Though I also shudder thinking how we'd end up taking their fury outside the airship. She stopped at that at first, but then couldn't resist adding, or are you afraid? I'm totally afraid, Jint declared flatly. They were right in the middle of an all-out war, and he was technically a soldier, so he'd given more than a passing thought to his death. But he wanted his death to be as far down the line as possible, and he didn't plan on having his life taken from him by old-fashioned gunpowder firearms on a land world. I understand. We have no desire to expose Imperial soldiers to danger, and they're just reaping what they've sown. Fazan picked up a transceiver and ordered the operation to be suspended. A faint but contemptuous smile was on her lips. Oh, please. Like you didn't bat an eye yourself back there. But Jint kept that observation to himself. I understand what you're contending, said Leifir, fed up. You do you? Said Dokfo. Well then, if you understand what I'm saying, then why won't you recognize me as Land World Citizen Representative? Because I don't want to. I can't possibly accept that as an explanation. Listen here. I represent an absolute majority of the population of Lobnis too. In other words, more than half of the people back me. As such, if you refuse to appoint me as citizen representative, Did it really escape you? Said Leifir, legitimately surprised. This is not hypothetical. There is no if. I am refusing to appoint you. Yes, I understand that. It's just a figure of speech, oh. In any case, I would like a clear and proper reason as to why you're rejecting me. No, Dokfo looked positively deflated. You can't just leave it at that. If only Jint were here, thought Leifir. She felt as though she'd only been able to avoid talking in circles like she was at the moment every other time she'd had to talk to land peoples thanks to his being at her side. Even if, at times, she picked up on a certain teasing tone toward herself and the awe in every word that came out of his mouth that left her irritated. I will not be speaking to you any longer. Goodbye. That's a shame. But I'm not giving up here. And with that, the call was severed. Leifir rose to her feet and addressed Ekrua. Do not pick up any other calls unless it's my adjunct. Yes, ma'am, Ekrua nodded. Ever since they'd selected the warden as the citizen representative, the other two self-proclaimed premiers had kept pestering them with call requests. At first, she'd replied with all seriousness, but they simply refused to back down, calling over and over again. As soon as a call from Dokfu would end, a call from Shung'er would come. And as soon as she'd, in her exhaustion, cut the line with Shung'er, Dokfu would be waiting on the other line to talk to her once more. After the second round of calls, they had no new arguments to make, so instead they changed up how they said them. Dokfu was fairly talented at it, while Shung'er's vocabulary was a bit limited. It had even made Leifier question whether the two were conspiring behind her back to arrange their calls just so. The fact that the other candidate for citizen representative, Anguzen, hadn't reached out to her could be counted as a blessing. Unlike the other two, he hadn't even seen the need to declare himself Star System Premier, so it was little wonder he wouldn't bother contacting her. There liege the lady. A call from the adjunct, reported Ekryua. Put it through. Humblest greetings from a chaotic land world, said Jint affectedly. I may be up in orbit, but I know full well. How's the situation? The rationing's over for the time being. We got fired at, but we haven't encountered any real issues. Fired at? By who? Despite the Land World Administration facing a civil war, the young Count seemed unfazed. Beats me, Jint shrugged. All we know is they're men. They didn't look into it? They haven't got the manpower. It's just like they told us before. The place is in turmoil. So you've come to the conclusion that it's not significant enough to react to? She trusted Jint. If he judged the goings-on to be no big deal, then it must really be a trivial matter. Yeah, just a bump on the road, that's all. I'll hand in the detailed report later. In the meantime, there's something more important to bring up. What is it? Lanusam Sir, His Excellency the Land World Citizen Representative, wants to emigrate. Is that all? The jailers and all of their families want out too. I'm told there are more than 20,000 people total. I see. Jint looked dumbfounded. That's all you've got to say? We're talking 20,000 people here. Don't tell me you're planning to push all the messy stuff on me. That shouldn't be a concern either. There's nothing to be carried out of this territory nation. We should be able to stow them aboard one or more of the supply ships making their way back. But where would their ultimate destinations be? We'd have to decide after stowing them. Is there some problem taking them to Alona Sebek, prison camp? She asked breezily. A prison camp. Jint was taken aback, but thinking about it. They might misunderstand, though. Their misunderstanding would eventually resolve itself. Well, I guess it wouldn't take much doing. When her call with Jint ended, she lifted her head to find Ekryua staring her way. What? A prisoner as citizen representative? I suppose that's how this plays out, answered Leifier. Huh. And then Ekryua faced forward again. Though it was paranoid of her, Leifier suspected Ekryua was smiling inwardly. Things were getting entertaining. A prison camp. Maydeen reacted as expected. We are not prisoners of war. Were you lying when you told us we'd be treated as subjects of the Empire? Please calm down, Your Excellency, said Jint. Think of it as more of a temporary pit stop than anything. A waiting place, if you will. What is a waiting place? Well, truth be told, there is no such thing as a waiting place. Technically speaking, the conception of prisoners of war in the humankind empire of differed greatly from other societies. In the empire, there were only two ways a war could end. Either the empire collapsed or the enemy lost its status as a sovereign interstellar power. So far, each war the Ov were a party to ended one way and not the other. Naturally, once a war ended, the government holding prisoners of war would be dissolved, with the rare exception of those administrations that survived as single-star system administrations. The Star Forces didn't view nations without space combat capabilities as threats. Enemy soldiers, who lost any warship upon which they could board, were made imperial subjects, whether they liked it or not, with total freedom to go wherever they so desired, so long as that wherever was within the empire. Most prisoners of war wished to return to their homeworlds. Unfortunately, it was not unheard of for a homeworld to not be annexed by the empire. Needless to say, the empire was not so soft-hearted as to return combat experts with years of experience to the enemy. That was where prisoner camps entered the picture. They were to wait there until the place they wanted to go back to was dragged into the Ov's mild autocracy. So if there's any territory nation within the empire you'd like to emigrate to, You can depart for it as soon as you like. There are no restrictions, said Jint. Maydeen seemed skeptical. What kind of place is this prison camp? Is it an orbital city? No. It'll be a land world. And probably one with more space than this place. So there are several such camps then? Yes. 14 land worlds have been made prison camps at present. Have you ever been to one of them? No, said Jint, shaking his head. But I have done my research. I see. Maydeen rose to his feet. Tell me, what will life be like there? The first year, your living expenses will be paid for. After that, it'll be the same as any other land world. You'll earn income by working or think about making a living some other, better way. Plus, it seems like it's fairly cozy. Stuff like maintaining order and constructing large-scale facilities is all financed by the Empire's coffers, so there are no taxes. There are even hospitals run using Empire funding, which is rare across land worlds. The biggest problem for residents of the camps is the waiting to find out in what way they'll be moved to another territory nation. But Maydeen's misgivings weren't dispelled quite yet. What about the labor? What kind of labor will it be? The main industry is development. Unlike here, there is no stipulation against reproducing, so there are people who establish roots across multiple generations. And as I said earlier, it's comfortable living. If a given world is judged to be self-sufficient without outside help, the Empire will even draw back, with the Land World Administration taking the reins. That administration's makeup would of course be chosen by the planet's residents. In other words, we would be taking on the task of expanding part of the Empire's dominion. Well, there's nothing stopping you from looking at it that way. And, though I hate to repeat myself, if there's anything that rubs you the wrong way, you're always free to emigrate anywhere you like. That is, if the Land World Administration of the planet you want to go to accepts you in. I see. Maydeen folded his arms. Can I ask you for background information about those 14 planets? Of course. Jint retrieved a memchip from the pocket of his long robe. The chip was shaped like the UH standard. Both the data format and the language provided were set with the receiving party in mind. You didn't need to do that for us. Our computers can read Imperial format memchips too, said Maydeen, taking it in hand. It's a courtesy. Now then, I'll be examining the contents carefully. I'll get back to you as soon as possible. There's no need to hurry, blurted Jint, his true intentions leaking out his mouth. In point of fact, Jint didn't want Maydeen to give him an answer before the magistrate, whose job this actually was, arrived to replace him and Lafier. There's something I'd like you to do for us first. I'd like you to choose the next Land World Citizen Representative. Maydeen took that like a sucker punch. The next Citizen Representative? So, the next Warden, you must mean. But the employees and their families will all be leaving this planet. Whether they're named Warden or Premier doesn't matter to us. I want you to select the person best suited to take responsibility for this planet of yours, that is to say, this land world, once you're all gone. This was what Jint refused to back down on. He was certainly aware what an oddball he was among the nobility. Nevertheless, he had taken on his noble rank of his own volition, choosing to live as a member of the kin of the stars to see where it'd take him. To get involved with the selection of a Landworld Citizen Representative felt like crossing a line as an off. Being an off noble despite hailing from a land world himself was a complicated enough position to start with. He couldn't imagine how things would branch out for him now that he'd hit this particular milestone. As for who would head the board of elections, he had, as a joke, suggested to Lafier that she should do it, but he didn't honestly think she'd be fit for the role, and it was a hard pass for Jint himself as well. And, most importantly, if Maydeen didn't leave behind a responsible land world administration in his wake, then this planet would succumb to out-of-control pandemonium. That much was crystal clear. The Empire had a peculiar penchant for boasting of its less savory attributes and pretending to be worse than it really was. It seemed to want to be viewed by land peoples as ruthless, but in point of fact, the Empire did not cast a blind eye on civil strife. Moreover, this world was teeming with professional murderers, and they were taking a sabbatical from killing only on a superficial level. As such, a civil war here would be especially grisly. Even just as a human being vested with empathy, Jint didn't want to see that kind of gut-churning spectacle. You say that, but... I'm not the one who bears responsibility towards this planet's future. The term Land World Citizen Representative sounds a tad belittling, but I'll use it just to make discussion simpler. What I wish to say is, the citizen representative is for the people who will be residing on this planet to choose. Yes, and I'd like you to work out a plan to make that happen. Are you asking me to hold an election? I leave the method entirely in your hands. But if you'll allow me to state my opinion, I believe an election to be the most reasonable approach. I see. Maydeen folded his arms. Clearly, Maydeen was less than enthused by this turn, but so too was Jint by his reaction. He couldn't afford to feel for the warden here. I can't authorize Your Excellency's emigration until the next citizen representative is chosen. I suppose you're doing as you must, said Maydeen, grim-faced. We do have extenuating circumstances, however. We'd like you to keep our emigration a secret to the inmates if possible. We have no idea what fresh hell would arise. But if we were to hold an election. So you were planning to leave in secrecy, said Jint, blinking. The thought hadn't occurred to him, but he did understand where the warden was coming from. Once the prisoners caught wind that the guards would be vacating the penitentiary, chances were high they'd act out. Yes, that's correct. Granted, we can't exactly sneak out without a sound. But we were planning to operate in secrecy until the time was nigh. That's why even only a select few of my subordinates know we're emigrating. You haven't even told the people who'll be leaving, shouted Jint, despite himself. Of course. Some of my employees are friendly with some prisoners. Who knows who would leak what? Then you don't even know if they want to leave. No, not with 100% certainty, replied Maydeen, his expression humorless, but they'll all want to relocate. Trust me. I don't know about that, thought Jint. He'd met many people with personalities similar to Maydeen's. He was likely just another person who didn't doubt they knew the optimal path in their head was the best for everyone. But Jint knew that was usually an illusion. With the exception of children in need of guardians, the Empire never forcibly put people aboard ships, but for the time being, he kept that fact to himself so as not to complicate matters. In any case, it seemed that there would be some quarreling by the time they were to relocate, and that at the moment, they ought to build up the strength they needed in anticipation of that eventuality. Well, if that's the case, then given that there are 3 candidates for Land World Citizen Representative, then shouldn't you gather them together to hash it all out? That in order? Heavens no. Not to repeat myself, but I leave the selection method to you. He had a feeling that he had been, and still was, running his mouth a little too much. Very well. We'll discuss amongst ourselves from here, he said, waving his hand as though he was done with Jint. Jint had seen United Humankind propaganda broadcasts before. They claimed that the land worlds ruled by the Av were occupied with an iron fist. Had Maydeen never caught a glimpse of that propaganda?